Thanks for joining us for our fourth session of the Nebraska Department of Education Science of Reading Professional Learning and Community of Practice series. I'm Abby Burke, the reading specialist with NDE, and this series is intended to be a collaborative learning experience around reading science research for educators to reflect on current practices and discuss ways to take action to implement research-based instructional practices. The four-part series features a professional learning session, such as this, and a corresponding community of practice for those interested in a deeper implementation. Each professional learning session is recorded. I put the link in the chat box for you to access those through the Nebraska Reads website. The community of practice that aligns with this session will be next Thursday at this same time. And if you haven't registered yet for that community of practice, please send me an email and I will ensure that you receive the link to attend. And I'm going to pass the mic over to my colleagues at TNTP who have partnered with us in developing this professional learning series. So Kenna, hi there.
Okay. Sorry. Great. Thanks so much, Abby, for that introduction. It's so good to see you all. We'll go ahead and get started. So as Abby said, this is our fourth session of the series. Today, we're really diving into analyzing and responding to data in foundational literacy. And I'm so excited because this is one of my favorite topics, anything about foundational literacy, but especially when we can close gaps for all of our students. I nerd out, so I'm excited that you guys are all here to nerd out with all of us as well. To get us started, while people are logging on, we're going to do a quick do now. I want you guys to look at this graph. This is the gap caused by the Matthew effect, and go ahead, look at the questions that are on the screen. So what does this graph demonstrate about reading achievement? What causes them? And then what can close them or prevent them from starting? So go ahead, think about those guiding questions and enter your thoughts in the chat. Wow, you all are hitting all the main points that I have on my notes. You guys are doing a great job with this question. I think something that in my mind really sticks out is that the rich get richer while the poor get poorer, unless, like you guys said, that we have strong explicit instruction and we're able to close those gaps right away, which is great because that's exactly what we're going to be focusing on today. So you guys are already getting to the main points that if we do nothing, that gap is just going to be bigger and bigger. But by really jumping in and having some really strong instruction and some intervention early on, hopefully that gap caused by the Matthew effect really closes quickly. All right. All right, well, like I said, it's good to see so many of you all. So I know a lot of you guys already know who we are. So I'm just going to introduce all three of us today. My name's Kenna McWhorter. I'm coming from you live from Dallas. I've been working in the early childhood field for about 8 8 years now. And early childhood is really my passion, especially phonics and anything with literacy. So again, can't wait to just talk about all of these great big themes today and really walk away with some concrete steps to help you improve not only the scholars that you're serving right now, but also just your schools and your districts as a whole. I also have on the line Caitlin McDermott, who's also coming from Dallas. She's been in the education field for a while with a varying degree of experience, so she'll also be chiming in with her thoughts on this. And then we also have Nimisha Thakur, who has been working really in humanities and literacy and helps us really think through that bridging the gap for some of our older scholars that may be struggling with some of these foundational skills. So thank you both for joining us, and we're excited that we're all here to be presenting this last PD session, but don't worry, you have one more week with us with the community of practice next week. All right, so today our goal is that participants will learn how to internalize data to pivot instruction and target lessons based on data. Participants will learn how to internalize data to pivot instruction and target lessons based on data. Specifically, we want to make sure that you walk away with understanding essential elements of a foundational skills diagnostic assessment. We also want to make sure that you know how to interpret that data to determine what individual students know and what gaps students have. And then finally, we want to ensure that there is a process for using data to plan whole group, small group, and individual instruction. Also, just something to note that in Texas, we call the Foundational Skills Diagnostic Assessment a screener. So if I use the word screener, what I really mean is Foundational Skills Assessment. So I just want to say that up front, that if I slip up in my wording, that's because it's so ingrained in my mind. But I've been working really hard on making sure I'm using the right term, but just to norm that I mean the same thing that you guys are thinking of. Any questions on our goals or outcomes for today? All right. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to dive in by reviewing some of the science of reading that we've already learned. Everything that we're talking about today is grounded in the science of reading, which is our best practices in ensuring that all of our scholars start in that strong foundation for their reading. The next few slides are slides that you guys have seen in every presentation, but we've focused on different parts of the slides. Today, we're going to be really thinking through what we've learned in the past that will help us with making sure we're doing the best things with our assessments. So you guys can see that we've already focused on decoding in our very first session, if you guys can remember back that far in October, where we talked about phonics and phonemic awareness. Then in the last two sessions, we've really been diving into that language comprehension with looking at strong vocabulary acquisition and then text complexity. I would love someone to come off mute, since we've all seen this slide 3 times. I don't think I need to define it. So I would love someone to come off mute and kind of explain what the slides means to them and just their learning from this slide.
So basically, I mean, we've just been talking about that without the language comprehension, if you have decoding but no language comprehension, we're not going to have reading comprehension. And then vice versa. We have the language comprehension, but we can't decode, then again, also, we're not going to have any reading comprehension. So you need to have both of them in order to have the reading comprehension.
Great, thank you so much, Alyssa. You said exactly my notes. It's like I sent it to you beforehand so you could know exactly what to say, so thank you. But yeah, you're exactly right, that if we don't have either that decoding or that language comprehension, it doesn't matter what we're doing with really strong phonics instruction or what we're doing with really great read alouds and close reading, because that reading comprehension will ultimately be 0 unless we're pushing both of those things. So we know that with focusing on our foundational skills assessments, that we're really diving into that decoding to be able to close any gaps quickly so that number can be higher. So then ultimately, when we're looking at the multiplication between decoding and language comprehension, it will have a high outcome. All right, so another slide that we've seen, but that goes to that decoding times language comprehension. And as those are weaving together our reading rope, that we're really developing strong reading acquisition. And so thinking about the previous slide and what Alyssa said really well is that we know with no decoding, there is no reading comprehension. Decoding would be that word recognition, so really focusing on the sounds, the letters, and the words. So how do we know if students are on the path to having strong word recognition? We know this because we're focusing on sounds, letters, and words. So I want you to think about this question. How do we ensure that students are learning these skills on the correct timeline and having the right instruction to minimize gaps? I'm going to repeat that question again because it's kind of 2 minutes long. How do we ensure that students are learning these skills on the correct timeline and having the right instruction to minimize gaps? I want you to think about that question and then answer your question in the chat, or answer the question in the chat. Yeah, you guys are all exactly right. I really like what Tracy and Alyssa said about making sure our instruction is aligned with that science and evidence. And then Alyssa, you specifically stated that scope and sequence, because we know if we're just teaching these phonics lessons, but it's not following an exact path of where scholars need or what scholars need, then the lessons are kind of pointless. And then to everyone's point that we have to have data. I also really like that everyone was able to grab out that we need more than just assessment. We also need that progress monitoring. Again, you guys are all saying my key points exactly. So I feel like I can just keep going because y'all are doing great and hitting my leading questions very well. All right, so the final slide that we've seen a few times is around that 95% of our students should be reading well with strong instruction. I want you just to read over the numbers. I know, again, we've seen this a few times, but I want you to read it and think about how does this impact our instruction and what does this mean for our scholars that we're teaching? So I'd love a few people to come off mute to go ahead and describe like what this slide means to them, and if they have like a bottom line of what this means towards their students or the instruction, go ahead and just kind of express what this makes you think about and any reflections you have.
So, I mean, I guess one of the big things that I'm looking at, that I'm seeing is that, that 40 to 50%, if we are learning to read, 40 to 50% are learning to read proficiently requires code-based, explicit, systematic, and sequential instruction. And even with getting that specific in your teaching and your instruction, you're still only hitting, half your kids.
Mm-hmm.
that, you know, I mean, that it's just, there's just so much more that we need to do.
Yeah, yep, I completely agree. I think something that also sticks out to me is that 35% will learn to read pretty naturally. And then that, like you said, Alyssa, that 40 to 50 really needing that code-based, explicit, systematic instruction. But then something I think is interesting is that really the bottom line is that it's not really a question of the student's ability. It's really a question of the instruction and what we're doing with the data that we're getting. And I think that is something that often we, think like, oh, the scholar may have some characteristics of dyslexia, so I'm just going to go ahead and have them work with the intervention. But when we're really thinking and looking at this slide, is that, again, the bottom line is that if we have the right instruction and we're really focusing in on the right gaps, we can make some incredible things happen for our kids.
I know my partner and I have talked about the fact that, this slide made me think of it, if our instruction is not what it needs to be, we could be producing students who look dyslexic, but they're not. So if we look at the numbers of kiddos that we're seeing in intervention or in resource, and it's not in alignment or anywhere close to this, then it's not the students we need to look at, it's the instruction we need to look at.
Yeah, that's a really great point, Brianna. Thank you so much for saying that. It's really interesting because in Texas right now, we screen our students for dyslexia in kinder and first grade. And I think there's this misconception that just because you're looking for characteristics does not mean we're saying that a scholar has dyslexia. What we're trying to do is, Brianna, like you just said, is fill in those gaps and ensure that we are doing as much as we can before we go ahead and make that jump to giving them dyslexia support. Because if we can close those gaps and give them the right supports early on, that dyslexia, even if they have it or don't, we can help make sure they're making that right traction early on versus just saying, oh, they're really going to struggle and be a struggling reader. Because we know from the Matthew effect that if we say that and we don't give them that right support, that gap is just going to widen over the years.
So I'm curious, what is the screener that you're talking about that you're giving kids? Is it like a phonemic awareness screener?
Yes, that's a really great point, Christina. So we're actually going to dive into some examples in a few minutes. And again, when I say screener, I'm trying really hard to say the diagnostic assessment. So it could test, ideally, it would test the phonemic awareness and your phonics skills that aligns with your scope and sequence that then aligns to your state standards. But often if you're not really paying attention to what you're testing or, what you're analyzing your data on, you might not always see the gaps. So that's exactly what we're going to talk about today is like, what is a strong assessment to give the scholars or the students? And then how do we respond to that data?
Okay,
Does that
great.
answer your question?
Yep.
Perfect. All right. So then before we move on to really diving into like what Christina said, what is the screener that we're talking about? What is that assessment? I just want to cap what we've talked about right now, recap what we've talked about. How does this information highlight the importance of collecting strong data in foundational literacy? Go ahead and think about that question, and then I'd love for some people just to chat their thoughts in the chat box. Yeah, these are all really great reflections, Christine. I really like what you said about urgency, because we know by going back to the Matthew effect that without urgency, that gap just widens and widens. I also really liked, I think, I'm scrolling back because there are so many great thoughts. I think it was, yeah, Tracy, I loved what you said about the two big pieces. I was wondering if you could come off mute and just tell us a little bit more about what you were thinking.
Sure. Try to say it clearly, I guess. I think there's a place for both types of assessment. But in this case, in the case of systematic and explicit phonics instruction, you need some type of data that inform what to do in a very specific way. So that has to be very closely tied to some type of curriculum and a scope and sequence, so that because of the nature of learning these types of skills, you are led into, okay, this is where the student is at on this skill, this skill, this skill, this is what I do instructionally. So I think both of those, but I think you have to distinguish between the purpose of one and the purpose of the other.
Yeah, absolutely. I really like what you said about the making sure like the assessment, the curriculum, and the scope and sequence all really align, because if you get some data and you're trying to implement and act on that data, but then it may go to a gap in your curriculum or a gap in your scope and sequence, you're really trying to like fix all these things. But what we're really trying to get at is making sure that the assessment, you know the assessment and you already know those gaps, so you're not surprised by what you're seeing. Meaning if like you're giving an assessment and there's a piece that's not in your curriculum, you will know that your scholars probably won't do well, so you can go ahead and be proactive. So it's really about being proactive about those three pieces. So thank you, Tracy, so much for your thoughts.
I think the norm referenced also gives you good feedback at a system level about the effectiveness of your instructional program. So that, I like going back to your slide earlier of that really, we should be getting 90 to 95% of our kids reading well, reading effectively. And I think the norm reference data can help tell us at a system level, are we providing the right type of core tier 1 prevention instruction?
Yeah, I love that. And that's a really good point for everyone that's also working with teachers of like, if you're seeing someone from that system level that those scholars are just not progressing, but all the other classrooms that scholars are progressing, you can quickly see that that may not be a scholar gap, that may be an instruction gap and needing to do some development with that teacher. So I think that's a really good point. Great, so next we'll be really moving into what are the essential parts of a strong assessment that we should be utilizing. Like we just were talking about, there's a lot of like gaps that if you're not using the right assessment or the right scope and sequence, that you really need to think through. So before you make that decision of what assessment that you should be using, I know a lot of that is predetermined. So some of this will just be information that you can use to advocate, but we want to make sure that you're really thinking through, what do I need in an assessment and what should I make sure I'm really advocating for? So we'll be moving into just the essential parts next. All right, so right now I'm dropping hopefully a link for 4 different screeners. If someone could just open that up and let me know that I set all the correct settings. I double checked it a few times, but you know, technology. Perfect, thank you, Abby. All right, so in those 4, or in that folder, I dropped 4 different assessments that all vary in different aspects of why you would use them. But I just jumped ahead of myself. So drop that, have that up. But first, what I want you to do before looking at it, because this will be helping you guide too much, I want you to picture your perfect foundational literacy assessment. So what we were just talking about, I know there were some questions of like, what does it look like? What is it? I just want you to think, looking at the skills that are on your screen. So you have kinder, first grade, second grade skills, because that's where we really would primarily be using this assessment. Sometimes you may need to use it for scholars that are struggling in upper grades, but really it would be that K through 2 band. And I added some of the skills that they're working on. So I just want you to picture, what would your assessment look like if you could just dream of your perfect assessment to get this information to help you fill those gaps of all what we've talked about. How often would you have scholars test? What skills would be tested? And then how would scholars perform the test? Just go ahead and brainstorm, and if you want to write down what you're looking for, because that will help you when you're analyzing the screeners in a second. So just picture and go ahead, take about 2 minutes to think of that perfect screener. All right, on your camera, if you're good to go, give me a thumbs up. If you need 1 or 2 minutes, just give me the time and I'll do a quick poll to see what we need. Great, I see mostly thumbs up if my in the moment data collection was accurate. So we'll go ahead and move on. So as we talked about, like, your curriculum may already come with an assessment that directly aligns with the scope and sequence, which is great if the scope and sequence is really strong. Sometimes we know with a curriculum, the scope and sequence may not be that strong, so that assessment that it comes with may not be the best choice, but it may also be a really great choice. So what I want you always to have the skills to do and to be able to lead others in is being able to go through what are the essential elements of a foundational skills assessment. So we're always looking for that alignment between the foundational skills assessment and your phonics scope and sequence. So if you don't have a strong phonics scope and sequence, that is a red flag first, to make sure you know what you're teaching when you're teaching, so you can pair that with the assessment. Then you'll want to make sure that you're looking for gaps in the assessment that you would need to fill. So meaning that if you have a really strong assessment for phonological awareness, that's great. But then if you notice it's only phonological awareness, you probably will also need to add in another assessment, which is totally fine to do 2 different assessments that are both really strong, but you just need to know what is on your assessment and what isn't, so you can go ahead and make those decisions ahead of time of how you're pairing those together. Or if you don't want to have to do the difficulty of finding those 2 different, a phonics and a phonological awareness assessment, making sure that you have something that has both of those aspects, especially in kindergarten. Right, and then ensuring that all the skills that are on your state standards from Nebraska are being tested. So making sure you're looking through holistically of what is required, what's in your scope and sequence, and then what's on my assessment. And then you want to make sure that that complexity is increasing throughout the year and giving you goals throughout that year, because if it's the same assessment that you give 3 times, those goals should be increasing obviously throughout the year. And if you have an assessment that has the same goal each year, and also doesn't state clearly what the goal is, that may be an assessment that has some strong ideas, but you can't act on it if you don't know how scholars are performing. All right, so now the link that I dropped in earlier, go ahead and open that up. I'm going to give you about 6 minutes to look at the 4 different screeners. You'll notice that they really vary in complexity and they vary in what they're testing. I want you to think about your dream assessment that you had created. And I want you to compare and see what's really strong in some of these assessments, and then what are some like gaps or some areas that may make you not, that you would need to fill in if you do select that assessment. So again, just thinking through all the things that we've learned throughout the past 3 series, and then all of our discussion today, definitely with those reading of science of reading slides. Think through what makes that screener strong and what's the screener that I probably have to do the least work with, knowing your specific phonics curriculum and the scopes and sequences that you're using right now. All right, so hopefully that gave you enough time to look at the different screeners. I'd love to just start with anyone who wants to come off, and we can just build off each other, so don't feel like you need to like wait on anyone. If something sparks what you also solve, feel free to jump in. What were some of the things that you noticed? What were some of the strong things about the assessments, and then some things that you had questions about or wanted to flag for others? So let's start with something that we liked about one of the screeners, just anything that you noticed that you're like, this would be helpful to have that information.
The past has some really in-depth phonological awareness, that sound manipulation that sometimes gets overlooked. There's a lot of information, it looks like, coming from that. And some of the other screeners didn't have anything like that, but the past also didn't have, it only did that, so.
Yep. I really liked how concrete the past was with a lot of those sound, like you said, the sound manipulation that we often don't see in assessments, that you could really, if you see someone struggling with those sounds, you could really help by having that really concrete information. Other thoughts? Thanks, Brianna, for kicking us off.
I'll go. So I have not seen the quick phonics screener, the last one that was on there, and I really liked it. I felt like it went kindergarten all the way through upper grades. And so some of the screeners that I've used, kind of quit around that second and third grade level. And this kind of encompassed the multisyllabic words and some of those higher skills that those older kids get that don't, it's kind of hard to find some screeners that cover those areas. So that was exciting for me to see that one. I'm going to probably be implementing that.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Lindsay. Something I like about that one specifically is with older scholars that you may not know where to start because they're on a totally different scope and sequence of that may not have that explicit phonics. Definitely if they're like in fourth grade, it's really hard to pinpoint where to even begin. And using something like FNP may not give you that phonics data that you need. And this at least helps you like give you somewhere to start with those older scholars that you really don't, maybe they're new to the school and you just don't have data on. It really allows you to see those gaps easily.
Absolutely. And because there's so many things you need to assess, I felt like this was a really quick way to get some good information, and you can get through a lot of kids and cover a lot of ground. And so I just really liked how it covered all those areas. And
yeah.
I had the same feelings.
Go ahead. I already talked.
I had the same feelings about the QPS because I teach third grade, and it's that same thing, trying to figure out what is it that they really need. We use the MAP testing. So we have that data, but that doesn't necessarily tell you, what it is that is the decoding part that they're struggling with. Because I have one reader, for instance, that I know he cannot read what's on a page, but if he hears it, he can tell me everything back, on it. So his comprehension is there. It's just these decoding skills, but I don't know where he's at. Mm-hmm. I don't know which things he needs to do, and not having, anything to really help me pinpoint that has been, challenging. So I'm looking forward to trying this out to see what kind of data it gives me.
Great. Thank you, Melinda. I think you just said something really interesting that made me think about math is really great to get like overall where a scholar's strengths of its comprehension, and it gives you that big picture, but it's really hard sometimes to act on it. And then when you're trying to look at the certain areas and pulling out strands that you can teach, there's so many strands and it gets so overwhelming so quickly that by using math in that way of, okay, I see that this scholar is lower in phonics or struggling in something, then you can go to another assessment to really give you that quick data to act, because math is, in my opinion, just so broad. Sometimes it gives you great data, but then on the other hand, it's overwhelming with all that data. Other thoughts on the screeners?
Well, I liked, so the quick phonics screener, I liked how the tasks are broken. So if you looked on the scoring form, each one of those tasks, it's kind of broke down like kindergarten, first grade, grade 1 and 2. So that, I mean, that was kind of nice to see, you know, kind of where they should kind of lie and land.
Yeah, absolutely. Any other thoughts on the screeners?
I was just going to say about the QPS, I didn't notice if the version you sent us did this, but they have, there's an A, B, and C test. So you can give A in the fall, B in the winter, C in the spring. So they aren't saying the same words over and over again. There's 3 different versions of that assessment.
That's a really great idea. Yep.
When someone was talking about the QPS and the multisyllabic words, so we actually have used the QPS for a while now, and sadly until this year I didn't know how to utilize that data. I'm like, they can't read multisyllabic words, wonder what you do about that. Now I'm like, oh, I know how to target that. But I noticed in the core phonics survey, like they break it down into what syllable types the student has a strength in or is perhaps missing. And so I was like, oh my gosh, that's even better, because I'm like, all right, they got closed syllables down, but man, they don't have, you know, the vowel team syllables or R controlled syllables. Those really throw them for a loop. So I liked, like, that got really specific.
Yeah, I agree with that about the core phonics. So kind of how I looked at it of where I was thinking is the quick phonics is really good for that overall, like, I don't know what's going on with this scholar. They're new to my class, they're new to my school, and I just need some quick information, especially for scholars that are struggling readers in those older grades. And then I personally thought that the core gave you a more concrete information if you're trying to match it with your scope and sequence in the lower grades. But again, there's a lot of really strong assessments out there, and it really comes down to what's your curriculum, what's your scope and sequence, and then what are the needs in your classroom, your school, and all of that in this conversation goes to, there's a lot of options out there, but we have to make sure we're really thinking through what are the needs and how do we pair that to have the strongest assessment out there. Because if you have, if you have all like 4th and 5th graders, it probably wouldn't be that great of a use of time to do the core phonics, right? But so every time, that's why all these 4 screeners are so different, is that there's different needs that we want to make sure we're addressing and we have options. There's a lot of strong assessments out there. These are just the 4 that I thought all have different like assets and different, also some different things I wanted you guys to think about that may be drawbacks to these assessments. All strong, but all, you know, again, you use them in different ways with different needs. Any other thoughts on these assessments before we move on? Right, great. Well, thank you so much for the great discussion around what we've noticed in these assessments. Before we move on to really now analyzing data with the assessments, I want you to consider these 2 questions and then feel free to answer either of them in the chat. So what are 3 things that you will always look for when choosing a foundational skills assessment after this discussion and this experience of analyzing the assessments? And then the other question is, how will your curriculum impact what screener sorry, that should say assessment, what assessment you choose. Go ahead and feel free to brainstorm and then drop those in the chat, and feel free to respond and build off of your peers' responses as well. Perfect. Thank you guys so much for those reflections. I saw a lot around making sure that this is easy to administer, but also easy to access that data and respond to. I also saw a lot around just being able to select the assessment per your needs. I'm going back to scroll up. Yeah, Christina, I think how you reflected on how other assessments may be stronger, but it may take work to do. I think spending the work, or the time to really think through what are the benefits of adding that extra time, and then how will that ultimately impact and our curriculum is really important. Meaning that if we have maybe a curriculum that's not the strongest, we're going to have to really know our scholars really well to really be able to tailor instruction towards them. So it may help them grow, even though it's more time consuming up front. But definitely agree that sometimes using those more than one test and with your curriculum is time consuming, but just really being thoughtful around what assessments we're using and how it will impact our instruction is really important. All right, so now we're going to dive into being able to interpret data from a foundational skills assessment. You guys saw this in your pre-work, that the assessment that we were going to focus on today is the core phonics assessment. So if you don't have that pulled up, or if you don't have that in front of you, if you print it out, that's the time to get it out now, and then make sure it's just pulled up computer screen if you don't have it printed out, because we'll be diving into some scholar data with that assessment. All right, so in front of you, we have a group of kindergarten scholars that just finished their middle of the year screener or their assessment. This teacher is really lucky because they have a pretty small class. When I taught kindergarten, I had around 26 scholars, so I wish I could interpret data for this few scholars. But you'll all automatically your eye is probably drawn to some things that are really strong, into some areas of growth and opportunity for certain scholars. When looking at your data, you really want to consider where are the outliers of the scholars who are not with their peers, but not only like making sure you're looking at those outliers, you want to go back to your scope and sequence and go back to your standards of where scholars should be right now. So just because you see that all of your scholars are performing at the same level, well, if that level is low compared to like the district norm, the state norm, probably not a great thing. So you want to make sure you're not only looking at the outliers in your class, but the outliers of your class compared to your the other classrooms, the other state, any information you have that you can compare that to. So when looking at data, you're also going to start looking for individual trends of those outliers, any groups that have the same area that they need to focus on. And then as a whole group, you're going to look for where do I need to push the whole group. But it's really important to make sure you're looking at that scope and sequence to know if everyone's struggling on something. Let me go back to the scope and sequence to see if they're struggling because it hasn't been taught yet, or if it's already been taught and they're still not getting it. So in this classroom, I don't have a scope and sequence for you to compare, but that would be ultimately the best, is having that scope and sequence. So I'm just going to tell you a little bit about this class and what they're teaching right now. So in this classroom, the teacher has been following the curriculum to a T. And this is, like I said, kindergarten. So in the first semester, they've really been focusing on letter identification, both capital and lowercase, letter sounds, and they're beginning to start blending CVC words. And sorry, when I say letter sounds, they've been working on the letter sounds of short vowels only so far. So again, they've been working on letter ID, letter sounds, short vowels only, and they've been starting to learn how to blend CVC words together. Something to note is that this teacher has not necessarily been looking at the Nebraska standards to implement any gaps in their curriculum. So she's doing a great job of teaching the curriculum. I'm going to say she's a first or second year teacher, so she's teaching directly out of her curriculum and her teacher edition, but she has not pieced yet missing pieces from the curriculum to the assessment. All right, so now I'm going to break you out into rooms, and in those rooms, you'll have about 8 minutes to talk about what are the class trends, the group trends, and the individual trends. To make it a little easier, because I know that PowerPoint will go away when we go into breakout rooms. I put a link in there for you to go ahead and open up the Google Doc. And I see that I have a kangaroo in there, so I can know that you guys can access it. You will be able to talk about this with your group and take notes, whatever you want to do, and we'll come back together to see if you've all really hit the same trends. So again, you're looking for class trends, group trends, and individual trends. Any questions? All right, perfect. And then Kim, we're ready to go out to breakout rooms whenever you're ready. All right. Hi, guys. How was that discussion around data? Great. See some head nods, some thumbs up. I should be so much better at quickly finding my share screen because we've been doing this for 9 months now and it still took me a second. But anyway, going back to sharing my screen. Can you guys all see the phonics or the data right now?
Yes.
And, okay.
Yes.
Okay, my green box isn't up there, so I'm like, what are we looking at? Cool. So thinking about the data, I want us to think through where we saw class trends, group trends, and then individual trends. So let's go ahead and start with some individual trends that we saw. I know we saw a lot of these trends because I heard a lot of this great discussion in your groups.
I know our group talked about James as an individual, that he was interesting and that he had his letter identification was really solid, but then he goes off the rails when it comes to the sounds. And then we also talked about Amanda. I have to move my thing a little bit because she was interesting. Her letter sounds and whatnot seemed good, but she didn't identify short vowel sounds, and yet she could read 11 out of the 15 CVC words, which was interesting.
Mm-hmm.
If she can't identify short vowel sounds, how is she reading CVC words? But she is.
Yeah, my prediction with Amanda is that she has a lot of memorization because you can see that she knows a lot about uppercase letters and a lot about capital letters, but then that shifts by 7 letters, and then the rest is just kind of a mystery of what she knows and what she doesn't know. So my guess would be there's some memorization and maybe the teacher's not digging deeper into those sounds.
Right. I would be interested in her phonological awareness as well. You know, does she see the word bat and has it mapped, but then to be able to pull that vowel sound out of it, could she do that?
Yeah, exactly.
Couldn't.
Perfect. Well, thank you, Brianna. Any other individual scholars that we were thinking about? And I like that, Brianna, what you did. You picked 2 scholars that weren't necessarily low, but they had some interesting things going on that they couldn't just necessarily go in a group that was struggling with letter identification, right? There are scholars that need a little bit more understanding to see where they're at, to really think through what group, or maybe they need something individually. But other thoughts?
Well, just thinking about Amanda, and I guess my thoughts kind of float as to farther down the road, looking at that, looking at, oh yeah, she has her letters and she can read all these words. I'm not worried about her because she can read. I see that a lot. I see some people that look at that and they're like, well, I'm not worried about the nonsense words because look at, they can read. But then the implications of that is like when you start getting into those multisyllabics. So when they start hitting that 3rd grade and the 4th grade, then all of a sudden their scores are tanking and they're like, but why? And it's because they don't know their sounds and now they're getting these huge sounds and they can't just memorize the words.
Yeah, that's a really great point. When you said that, I wanted to look at in the assessment, sorry, 1 second. Yeah, I was looking at how many of the CVC words were nonsense words versus just plain CVC words to see if maybe that's where she was able to, yeah. So there's 10 real CVC words and then 5 nonsense words. So that could be where Amanda has them memorized and then she was able to come up with one of the words. But I think looking at that nonsense and that CVC is really important when you're analyzing that data to see, are they memorizing the words? I know when I gave kids nonsense words that were like really high performing scholars, they'd look at me like I was crazy and they're like, that's not a word. Like, well, just sound it out anyway. Great. All right. So we talked about some great trends that we saw in individual. What about some groups that were standing out to us?
Well, we just, like in our group, we just talked about how the long sounds, that, as a group as a whole, they don't have those, they're not solid on that. But then it also made sense because she hasn't taught that yet. You had talked about that, she had done the letter identification and the sounds and the short vowels, but no long sounds yet.
Yeah, exactly. And that's the exact point, that she hasn't taught it yet. That's when you need to go into looking at those standards and looking into your curriculum to see when does that come up and when should scholars really be knowing those long vowels. Yeah, other groups that we're noticing that we may want to give some support to. And it's okay if you don't say their names, but if you just say like, some scholars are struggling with this, so I would support them.
Well, some scholars are still struggling with just letter recognition, and that would be something I would want to support.
Yeah, absolutely, because you can see if they've been working on letter sounds for a semester now, or letter identification for a semester now, and a lot of their peers are at least at that almost whole way with the 26, but we have a lot underneath that. Great. Any other groups that we're noticing? I'd love to hear from someone that maybe hasn't spoken yet. Right, well, I would say the last group that I would probably focus on is those scholars that are still really struggling with sounds. And some of those are the same, and some of those vary from they knew their letters and now they're struggling with sounds, but making sure we're meeting all the scholars that are not only like on the column C, but also that column E, because if those correlations are strong, that should go to strong CBC words. Right, and so then before we move on to talking about how we look at, not how we look, but how we intervene with data, I'd love to just finish up this section with some questions around reflection, or with some reflection questions about what was simple about the process and then what was difficult, and then any new practice that you'll start after this process. And you can, enter those in the chat, or you can come off mute, whatever you feel more comfortable with.
One of the things I thought was just really challenging was looking at data separately from curriculum. It's just really kind of, it leaves some questions kind of hanging out there, like, I don't know, what did this look like, or how was it taught? Exactly where are we in that sequence? Those kinds of things. So that was hard for me to feel confident about drawing conclusions, having that being a separate piece. And it also really emphasized the importance of taking the time. If you don't have a curriculum that embeds really strong assessment within the teaching and learning process, to not allow students to fall through the cracks, how critically important it is to align it with your scope and sequence, whatever assessment you would use. And that's just, I found that to be challenging. So.
Yeah, absolutely. And Tracy, I think what you said really resonated with me, because often when people do have that, like they know what is being taught and they know their curriculum, they don't always go back to actually look at the scope and sequence. So just because they have that context, they feel more comfortable not opening up the scope and sequence in their curriculum. And, that was kind of not my thought with not having a scope and sequence. There was just too many to have. But it also made me realize that even if you know the curriculum, you still need to open that curriculum up while you're analyzing data, which I think is a really important takeaway. So thank you for stating that.
I guess I would also add to that, I think it's important to have some kind of guidance on decision rules around that too. So if you do have X number of students or percent of students who aren't meeting that expectation at whatever point you're at in your instructional scope and sequence, then you should have some guidance or idea of, at what point do you decide, okay, this is a class-wide issue. I need to kind of rethink where my whole class is at, maybe target some reteaching for the whole class, that kind of stuff. And it's hard to not have that together.
Yeah,
So.
Yep, absolutely. I completely agree. And I think that's a good push for anyone that's working with school leaders or teachers, or maybe not in the classroom, or even if you're in the classroom talking to other people around where that should be if it's not clear, but making sure that you're setting up all the teachers and everyone for success of this is the benchmark at this point, and being really clear, because the core phonics had it kind of, but it was hard to see exactly where they should be to know overall, are they a benchmark intensive or where they're at. But yeah, making sure you have clear normed where scholars need to be is really important. Cool, and thank you for those that saw, yep, it was easy, or that, thank you for those that typed in the response. It was easy to see the strengths, yep.
I was just going to piggyback too on what Tracy said. I think, when we analyze data, it causes us to continue to ask questions and to dig deeper. And so when we have the time to see the data displayed as a professional group of educators to problem solve around that together, I think that's really helpful.
Yeah, absolutely. I love that thought. Thank you, Mary Jo. All right, and so then moving us kind of quickly, because we probably could have a lot of discussions around data and curriculum and scope and sequences. Well, curriculum is scope and sequence, but we could have a lot of conversations about that. Knowing that we're almost out of time, I want us to make sure we have some time to actually practice one scenario of utilizing data to implement strategic interventions and giving feedback to students. We talked a lot about this a lot at the beginning of the session about how closing gaps quickly and being able to see that any gaps that scholars are doing. So maybe you have data and find, automatically, what was her name? I think it was Amanda, Susan, one of them are struggling with letter identification. So I'm going to make sure when I'm teaching my lesson, I'm giving her feedback in the moment. So we're going to talk about that right now, about making sure we're really helping our scholars and not always waiting for data to roll in, because that can take so long throughout the year, especially if you're only giving 3 assessments, beginning, middle, and end. We want to make sure we're really thinking about effective teaching and instruction that will support them. So you guys can see the 5 things on the screen. We want to make sure that we're teaching the essential skills and strategies. We're providing differentiated instruction based on the results and adapting to meet students' needs. We're providing, and I saw this a lot in the comments earlier, we're providing that explicit and systematic instruction with lots of practice. And then we vary how much support and feedback we give to make sure that they're not struggling too much, but we're also seeing where scholars are at. Then we're providing opportunities to apply those skills and strategies with reading and writing. And then we're not just covering just the critical content, and we're being sure that students learn it. So we're not just saying, okay, I've taught this, I can move on, but we're really monitoring students' progress regularly and then reteaching and addressing those misconceptions immediately and as necessarily as we need. All right, so go ahead and I want you just to quickly read this quotation on the slide. So as you can see, these types of interventions would very quickly address any needs. And originally I was going to have us discuss why this would have such a high impact, but knowing all of your answers throughout today have been spot on and we're running short on time, I'm just going to wrap it up for us that we know that when more aggressively monitoring and fixing those misconceptions in the moment, and we're being able to give ample opportunities, and we're just giving extra at-bats, and then we're able to shorten the loop of giving that, instead of making them wait and wait for that interaction of that feedback, we're shortening that loop and giving it to them directly so that they can reapply right away versus having to wait, or in some cases never getting that feedback of what they're doing wrong. So that's why these 3 things are all really successful interventions. Right, so in terms of monitoring our scholars and our students, we're needing to assess and understand in different ways. So we have 3 main things, and there may even be more depending on your curriculum and depending on just how often you assess scholars, but usually there's that foundational skills assessment, and typically, not always, but typically there's a beginning, middle, and end, or maybe that's how often your district or your school wants you to test. And then in between there needs to be some sort of progress monitoring to see how you're doing. So those may be bi-weekly quizzes, or there just may be some tracking that you're doing to see if scholars are going from the beginning of the year to the middle of the year. I know that's the gap I would say right now in my district, is that we have really strong foundational skills assessment, but what we're not doing at all of our schools is doing that progress monitoring. So then when we get to the middle of the year, teachers like, wait, I thought I've been teaching so explicitly and I've been following the scope and sequence perfectly. And then my question is, well, did you have the data to know how you're giving that daily on the spot feedback and correction? And the answer often is no. So making sure that you're doing all 3 of those things, assessing at the beginning, middle of the year, progress monitoring, and then knowing what feedback and correction you're giving. So here is the assessment to action screen. And I think this is really helpful when you're thinking of, okay, I have this assessment data in front of me. Now, what do I do with it in the moment? So when you're preparing for instruction, I think intellectually preparing for a lesson is really important. It's often easy to skip in a phonics lesson because your phonics lesson is scripted for you often, so you don't need to do that. But what you need to do is looking at the data and then scripting in what scholars are you going to ask those questions. So I think this is a really helpful graphic of when you're preparing for your instruction, you're going to teach, then you're going to observe and investigate why. And I think that acting is really helpful because there's 4 different ways that you can act, but you need to think about, why is the student responding this way? And then what trends did I see? So the ways you can act, you can see those on the screen, that you can give corrective feedback. You can plan to reteach, or make sure, or you can just integrate that into future instruction. If you're seeing it's a whole group trend, cool, you can just readdress tomorrow. You can provide additional pieces of opportunities, or sometimes you may need to dig deeper to understand that root cause. So thinking of the student that had like all over the scores numbers, she probably will need some digging deeper on that. But those are 4 different ways that you can act in the moment when you're seeing something go wrong. I think what's important is that you're really thinking about, why is that individual student responding that way? And then thinking through what's the best way to act, because how you act will really depend on how quickly they will understand what's going on and where their error is. Right, so going back to the idea of correcting in the feedback, there's some different ways that you can diagnose that error, and then you can act accordingly. So there's some like not yet taught. So you need to see if that's a priority, or just let it slide if it's not yet taught. Misapplying a skill, then you're just going to naturally repeat what the scholar did and see if they self-correct. And then if they don't know the skill, remind them what it is. So once you remind them by saying, you know, whatever, if they still make that same error, then you're going to remind them of the mistake they're making. And then if you're reaching that frustration level where you can see you've naturally repeated what they said, they didn't catch on, so you reminded them of the skill and they're still getting frustrated, make a note of it, move on, and then provide that guidance in maybe a small group or a one-on-one setting. So something that I like to think about is before you think, what should I do? You always need to consider, why did the student make the error? Right, so finally, what we're going to do is analyze and practice giving in the moment feedback. Really passionate about giving in the moment feedback, not just waiting until you see everyone making the same errors. So the scenario is that this week we've been reading a decodable on the bus. It's from CKLA and it's in Unit 8, so that would be at the end of your kindergarten year. The focus is double consonants and K spelled CK. So students are writing a response to the question, where did mom sit? While circulating, the teacher has noticed that Thomas has written, she sit in the back. All right, so you have 1 minute to provide corrective feedback. What might the conversation sound like? But before you think about that, I want you to think, what are all the errors? What's causing the error? And then what's the highest priority based off of our objective? And how can you foster a productive struggle? So real quickly, if you guys just want to throw in some of the errors that you're seeing, you can throw those into the chat. Yep, one is that he's not using the CK at the end of the back. Yeah, exactly. So we're seeing that there's no capitalization, there's no period, using sit instead of sat. Great. So, and I think someone already answered this for us, that the biggest focus is the CK. So in kindergarten, yes, that sit sat is important, but the biggest focus based off of our objective is making sure they know that CK. Real quickly, I know we're almost out of time, but usually we would discuss like, how would you give that feedback? Does anyone want to come off mute and just say how they would correct that feedback to that scholar in the moment quickly?
So like, I mean, I guess looking at like the sit or sits or sat, not a priority. So maybe just, just to correct that. With the back, it would be a reminder of the rule, because it's something they just focused on. Remember when we talked about today, the CK, and kind of reinforce that rule to where that, and then, as far as like the capitalization and the punctuation, it would depend on like where they're at with the teaching of that. I mean, is it something that you're not worried about yet, and that's something down the line, so you just leave it alone, or what?
Yeah, I think that's exactly where I would go, Alyssa, is asking, hey, what did we talk about today? Yes, we talked about CK. All right, go back and look at this. What do you notice? Great, good job. And then I think something you could do, if you're seeing that whole class is missing that she said, or that capital and period and whatever, you could always do a quick show call and have one scholar doing it right, one scholar that is missing that, and have scholars analyze their own work, but not spending a lot of time on giving feedback, because your main focus is making sure they know that CK. All right, well, that was a quick ending of our scenario of practice, but as you can see, giving feedback is that important, or that quick and that effective, that hopefully that scholar will now fix that error and go on his merry way knowing CK. All right, so thank you guys so much for a great conversation around targeting our scholars or targeting our teaching with our scholars data. Quickly before we log off, I want you to think through the last two questions of how will targeted feedback impacts students' outcomes. So that was from this last session or this last part of the session. And then overall, any aha moments from today. So go ahead, feel free to type those in the chat. I'll be staying on to read all of your thoughts. And thank you guys so much for attending. I hope this was helpful, and I hope it will impact your instruction and the conversations you have with your peers a lot. Yeah, and to Abby's point that we look forward to seeing you next Thursday. Great, I'm so glad that you guys enjoyed this screeners. I'm glad they were helpful. Thank you guys for a great session too. Thanks, Mary Jo.